Welcome to Let's Talk Global Business, the show where we look at the economic and business trends connecting the world. I'm Sara Murray, Managing Director International at the Conference Board, the member-led global think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. Europe's relationship with China is at a turning point. Trade and investment links remain vast, but political trust is thin. The EU speaks of de-risking, not decoupling, while China calls for renewed cooperation. Meanwhile, US policies and regional alliances are redrawing the map of global trade. And so joining me today is Joerg Wutke, partner at DGA Albright Stonebridge Group, and Max Zenglein, Centre Leader for the Economy, Strategy and Finance Centre in Asia at the Conference Board. Welcome both. So, to kick things off, I'm going to ask you both a simple question. Should Europe and China get closer? Joerg?
Well, I don't think they should get closer, but it's unrealistic. Actually, if they maintain the kind of connection they have right now, that would already be a massive advantage. I see more drifting away, frankly speaking. We definitely should stay engaged. Climate change is one of the topics, but Xi Jinping had made it very clear. He wants to have self-reliance. Trade will be challenged. We have overcapacity coming from China into the global markets, challenging our industrial landscape. So yes, we should stay engaged. Getting closer, I don't see that coming.
Max, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think I agree with that, and it's really about managing the relationships and setting a new updated framework that reflects the structural changes that are changing the global trading regime and for that matter the global order. So I think the matter of closeness also needs to reflect that type of reality. So we're going to have a different starting point and actually what defines close, and as beneficial also the past was for the trading relationship, it's not the basis for the future, and if it's not addressed adequately, it will actually lead to more confrontation. I think that needs to be avoided.
So you've both seen this relationship evolve over many years. Does now feel different? Does it feel a defining moment? And do you think it's primarily economic pressure, political values, or both? Joerg?
It is different because China used to be a market for us for machinery, for top-end cars, for chemicals. They bought our stuff. We were just fitting their industrialization and urbanization story really, really well. And now basically they evolve into our realm. Basically they have now better cars. They have likewise chemistry. So in a way, what is there for us to sell? But we meet them as competitors on global markets. Their ships are heading into our harbors. So they turn from a consumer to a competitor in the economic part. And then, of course, Ukraine didn't help. The fence-sitting of China, basically helping the Russians to maintain their war chest, has certainly not helped us politically. So in a way, yes, it has been shifting. And then, of course, Xi Jinping's clear policy of self-reliance, that indicates already, guys, we don't need you anymore to the extent that we used to.
Max?
Yeah, so I mean, it's definitely a defining moment, and I think it's bigger than just EU-China changes that are evolving, and the relations with the US are changing. So it's an extremely dynamic and volatile situation, which I think none of us predicted 5 to 10 or 10 years ago, and yet all of this that's unfolding now was brewing underneath, and so I think there was also a lot of underestimation of to some extent also wishful thinking maybe of how China will evolve. And so that has to do with wishful thinking in terms of how their reform process and economic system would evolve, and also some underestimation on how quickly changes come about in China, not only economically, but also how they're presenting themselves globally. So this is causing the frictions that I think that we're seeing now. And I think an underlying feature is, and this goes for European capitals as well as Beijing, a lack of mutual understanding of some of the underlying pressures that are also building up domestically and internationally. Yeah, it's really high time for a better understanding and acceptance also of what others are going to need to do in order to survive, to be honest.
Mm, mm. And how do you hear from business European business leaders? How do you think they describe what's going on at the moment?
Well, it's a fluid situation, and Trump administration is not really helpful. I mean, the complexity of doing business with China in China is very hard to estimate. The parts I buy there, the software I buy there, can I actually then put it together as a product and sell it to the United States, for example? Then secondary sanctions make an impact. I mean, you can now see the politicization of Nexperia, which makes it very,
Mm.
very hard for the car supply chain to remain intact. So in a way, we have rarely ever seen the kind of complexity in geopolitics that we face right now. And I think the big picture is just really the US and China see themselves as opponents. The Europeans have to find their space somewhere, and business has to figure out if there's still a global market or if there are three markets, meaning China, the United States, and the rest of the world.
Yeah. Max, what are you hearing in Asia?
Well, so there is a lot of it's shaped by uncertainty, and I think there is a I feel if I especially reflect on 2025 so far, it's always hoping for the next political messages that create some form of certainty that you can then react to, and I think it is a volatile situation, but it also means you need to make decisions in a volatile market where, well, the relations with China have changed dramatically, and it goes to market potential within the Chinese market, but we also see Chinese companies going global. And I mean, I'm based here in Singapore. If you go out here, Chinese vehicles all over the place, and it doesn't matter if it's private vehicles, it's also buses. These are all Chinese vehicles, and this is also part of a reality and a competition of different economic systems and a very capable Chinese companies that companies need to brace themselves for.
Yeah. How do you think China interprets Europe's language? There's a lot of new language about strategic autonomy. Does it sound like containment or simply caution to the ears in China? Yeah.
Well, I think China notices a massive cacophony coming out of Europe. After all, Europe is Britain, is Serbia, is Hungary, which are very friendly towards China, the two countries. And then you have the Scandinavians, which are definitely more negative. And then you have Brussels. You have a language that talks about de-risking, caution, and so forth and so forth. Of course, I mean, Beijing frames it very easily. They say, oh, Europe turns protectionistic, not very nice, and then starts bullying at some areas. But I think that they still regard Europe as important, certainly nowhere close to the importance that the United States is for China. But the language out of Europe is something that is also very hard to decipher. Who is listening in Beijing to European voices, and do they actually act upon it? So do the diplomats find a language that actually finds the attention of the president, for example, to be a little bit more forthcoming and engaging with Europe? Or do they frame it in a way that they assume that he wants to hear it and precast a storyline that means that Europe is basically the poodle of the United States, which is very commonly thought so in Beijing. So the problem really is that unless we engage and talk to each other, and particularly at the top, misunderstandings will arise, and this atmosphere is ripe of misunderstandings, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Yeah. Max?
China would prefer just to talk about cooperation and exploring mutual beneficial relations, but yeah, the reality is China is also, as Joerg already put forward, pursuing self-sufficiency and is pursuing economic security in overdrive, and so that's part of the mutual understanding. This is part of the new reality, a globalization that is being shaped by economic security and geopolitical interests, and yeah, while Europe is trying to find the right language of this, China is also very sensitive then to the language coming out. So there's also mutual acceptance of the situation. Also then requires to understand, okay, we are trying to preserve our economic security, so are you, and we need to see how we remain as compatible as possible in order not to avoid confrontation or a complete or an excessive kind of decoupling that, it's happening, but I think we still can contain it to some extent.
Mm. I think then what we're really seeing here is Europe. It is at this inflection point, but it's this mix of realism and restraint. So the question isn't whether ties will continue, but just how to manage a relationship that's both indispensable and imbalanced. And
Well, I mean, for
yeah.
Europe, there's a lot of the China speed is a really a challenge here because, basically what's left of manufacturing in Europe has become an endangered species. Europe needs to protect it in order to preserve it, and that takes some vital steps. And you just can't take a wait and see approach because the Chinese competition will roll you over.
Which requires coordination among EU member states, which sometimes is, well, as we're seeing, is proving very, very tricky when the national interests collide with, a coherent response from the EU. So that's what also kind of makes it a lot more complicated for China to also know what the real message is, because there isn't always alignment. If we think about de-risking, we hear that buzzword. It's the buzzword of the year. What do you think that looks like in practice, Max, for European companies, trading or investing in China?
So, like you said, it's a buzzword, and to be honest, I think there is, for the majority, it's not being put in practice. It's only being put in practice maybe if there's a pain point, and then it's about managing the sudden disruptions. As we've seen with Nexperia now, and I think that's a very good example.
Yeah.
It still reflects that the reality de-risking comes with a price tag, and I think a lot of companies are not yet willing to bear that price tag that comes with improving economic security and supply chain resilience. I mean, the rare earth is another example. The dependency is known for over a decade, and yet it's been accepted because still it's just it's economically still makes sense, and China is a vast and cheap provider of these goods. So that makes it tricky in order to accept the cost today for a risk that may or may not come in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, the trade-offs of the de-risking, the higher cost, the slower growth, it's necessary for resilience, but quite painful.
I mean, Max used to work for Merix. We did the BDI, the German Business Association, and Merix did a study that came out about 5 years ago, clearly defining that we have incredible dependency on China in very few areas, but these are serious. It's rare earth was number one. It was vitamin B, it was magnesium, it was the pharmaceutical precursors, the APIs. But again, it's very difficult to get something going because we live in a liberal market condition, and to build up your own refinery is very difficult. The Chinese nearly own all the technologies. To produce APIs is very expensive, and in both cases, we have a not in my backyard syndrome, meaning the Chinese accept the pollution in order to get rare earths and APIs, and in Europe it's not acceptable. So in a way, we are our own worst enemy in this respect, that we say, okay, if the Chinese are willing to pollute again and continue to pollute, that's fine with me. And now all of a sudden we realize that we cannot have cars, we cannot have pharmaceuticals without the Chinese sitting at the top end and sort of controlling, turning the tap off or turning the tap on again. And so there has to be a real Manhattan Project, in the sense of that we pool with friendly countries and say, okay, in 10 years, we want to put the dependency on China on rare earth on zero. The same as we have to work with the Indians on the supply chain for pharmaceuticals, because we can see now, and the Chinese will not change the game, they politicize all of that. So we knew it. We didn't have the industry policy in order to make it happen. We are shareholder valued. Shareholders don't appreciate high cost, for example, to move up to a new technology, which in the first years is always very expensive. And so now we have to realize that maybe we need a little bit more engagement of government and companies in order to get out of this hole.
But this is the point, though, right? If you think about the EU Critical Raw Materials Act, right? Disappointing so far because Europe didn't pull enough investment or have the coordinated policy. And then you've got the countries guarding their sovereign rights on export controls and industrial policy, that have actually ended up being more dependent on Beijing, not less. So you've got this problem where Europe wants autonomy and resilience. They can't get there without the collective strategy and serious investment. So it's
Yeah.
almost like this is the real world test of whether de-risking actually works, and also shows the limits, the political limits of Europe's strategy. They
Yeah.
want the economic security, but they don't have any leverage.
Yes. Yeah, it's changing technology is one thing, but how do we do this? There's a lot of money involved. There's a lot of time frame to cover. And again, whenever you come up with something like, for example, Mountain Pass in the United States, where they were developing a rare earth mine, the Chinese lowered their prices to make it absolutely non-attractive for everyone else to be in the marketplace. So we have to sort of see if we play offensive, meaning putting money where our technology is, and see if we can manage to become less dependent on China. And we have to play defense in the sense of then we have basically protectionist measurements at our borders to say, we don't buy that kind of Chinese stuff in the magnitude we want. But it's politically very charged and very difficult. And the other one, de-risking, is certainly also to consider going into other markets. To say, okay, we source more from other countries and we sell more. And there the EU Commission is actually on a good pathway, unlike the United States. They signed, after 30 years of negotiation, a free trade agreement with Mercosur, the South Americans. So in a way, now is the time to maneuver Europe and their companies in a manner that we can actually survive the kind of self-reliance policies that Xi Jinping and Donald Trump have in mind.
Yeah. Max, from what you're hearing on the ground, obviously there's the China for China strategy, but there's also companies trying to diversify production away from China, change their supply chains. What are the kind of challenges that you're hearing that companies are running into?
So I mean, the China plus one is easily to be said, but it's more difficult to implement. So and I think the fact is, and we've touched upon this already a few times. China is extremely competitive in all these areas. So you're moving into an area where actually, economically speaking, you can't compete with China. So it will take time to build up capacities here, and it requires a bit more also prioritization and coordination, for example, how to cluster and where to cluster certain industries and sectors. And what you're seeing here now is that if you look at ASEAN countries, they're all competing against each or with each other for similar investments. There is a lack of coordination. And so I think this is something where there is a lot of room for improvement. And I think companies would cherish if there's more political framing that goes into it. Now, we've mentioned the free trade agreement with Indonesia. I think that now needs to be implemented and hopefully facilitate also stronger business ties. And I think the positive story that Europe can really bring to the region is to help these economies here in the region to develop, to strengthen their manufacturing sectors, to also move up the value chain. Because the reality is, for them, it's also for a lot of the emerging economies here, it's going to be very difficult to develop their economies in a way that or based on the way that China is behaving at the moment. This is very difficult. So this is, I think, presents a lot of opportunity where Europe can approach the region, say, okay, let's cooperate together. And this includes, I think, the Chinese operations of a lot of European companies, because successful diversification, as ironic as it may seem, the successful diversification of China will depend on a strong collaboration with their China operation to make that happen. They're here in the region, and I think there's a lot of talent also there that can be used. So I do think that really presents an opportunity.
Yeah, no, indeed. When you think about the EU member states approaching de-risking, is it consistent? The splits that you see between the national interests and the Brussels agenda. What's your view on that?
Well, it's depending on the country. I mean, countries like Malta and Cyprus don't have the industrial landscape to have a need of de-risking. They rather would like to open the floodgates and say, would you please, tourists, particularly Chinese tourists, come over, which is a way how to generate business for their local economy. And then, of course, you have these high-tech countries like Holland, that are now in a difficult situation because their companies compete more and more with the Chinese globally. And now we have the Chinese entering the marketplace. Shall they become protectionist or not? And then, of course, the big question mark that all of us have is, do we want the Chinese to invest in our economy? Do we want the Chinese companies to actually create jobs in our backyard? And that's tricky. And now Nexperia is certainly sort of the example where people get jittery and say, oh, that they remote controlled from Beijing, and all of a sudden a good company cannot deliver anymore. At the same time, you have this wonderful success story of Chile taking over Volvo, safeguarding the Swedish car manufacturer and making it a huge success story. So I think we should try to learn from this Nexpedia case, which I hope will deflate soon. At the same time, we have to basically tell the Chinese, you can't endlessly sell into our economy. We have to produce. So BYD, CATL, Huawei, all these companies come to our economy. We welcome you. And stop talking about basically this kind of self-reliance in your own economy, because we want to be a partner. China stands for 33% of global production. Every third product is made in China. And now with the 15th five-year plan, China's indicating they want to move towards 40%. And that is a zero-sum game. I mean, they tell the world, you produce less, I do this for you. This is not going to create jobs in our backyard. So our discussion has to lead how much spine do we have to protect our economy back home, even with protectionist items? And how do we tell the Chinese that actually they should play open with us in their own economy and basically come over to us and create jobs?
Yeah. Max, anything you want to add?
Yeah, so I very much agree with this, and this kind of also reflects what I was saying, that what companies should be doing here in the region, but the same goes for Europe. So there is de-risking from China with Chinese help. So and I think that's the way forward. And this is exactly also what China is doing with European companies in China. They're also, where there's vulnerabilities, they want to have European companies pursue in China for China, which means they are localizing their supply chain, they're localizing their R&D in order to ensure that China will have access to the technology and not be exposed to any supply chain shocks. And they're trying to limit these areas. So I think there is a lot to learn from China's approach to engage, in this case for Europe, with Chinese companies to make it work, because the reality is then also Chinese companies that operate in Europe will have to abide to the rules and regulations in the marketplace here. So it enables the policymakers to take much or take the level playing field into their own hands. So, and I think that is indeed one way forward, and it should not be about raising the barriers and keeping China completely out. I don't think that's very realistic, and this, I think, would be part of a pragmatic approach that sets clear rules, but also shows a willingness that you're able to cooperate with China, but you also set the terms.
Yeah. So do you still see opportunity for constructive cooperation, like in the green tech, the climate transition, or the digital innovation space?
Definitely. I mean, you see major German companies pouring money into China, and for one reason, and that's what I always label the fitness center China. They just have an incredible speed from which we can learn. You can see the German car industry, in particular, trying to unlearn how to build cars in order to manufacture mobile phones on wheels. China is champion. So, we have been, to stay in the jargon, sleeping on the wheel. We have been missing out on the chassis, the body, for 2 years. So we have to catch up, and companies like Volkswagen team up with XPeng in order to bridge that gap. And digitally, Volkswagen said we're behind 6 years. So the money poured into China helps these companies to actually catch up and then replicate this learning in their global manufacturing sites. For example, the BMW 7 is designed in Shanghai but produced in Munich, this kind of thing. And the other one that we definitely have to realize is that we are learning how to just get faster. Speed lab to market, for example, it's not going to be in 24 months, it has to be in 15 months. learning that again we can replicate. And that's where I see the danger for the United States. As companies are better protected here, there is the wall that might give them some breathing room. At the same time, they're cutting themselves off from the learning experience that China provides. So I think that the learning with China is very important, and if China produces the cheapest wind turbines and solar panels, it's great for the green transformation. Why not using these items? And if China is now developing a better biotechnology, maybe they find better cancer cure than we have. I mean, the best lung cancer treatment right now globally is made in China.
Yeah, indeed. Max, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, this is there's lots of ways to cooperate, but the reality is, I think, then also if you look at green tech, for example, I mean, this is something that is at the end of the day also technology and energy dependency that comes with that. So, and I think this is the challenge in the contradiction that, or the policy choice that you have between, yes, of course, we could accelerate the green energy transition by engaging with cheaper Chinese goods, but we also need to, I think, preserve the own capabilities in this technology sector. And I think it reflects, a lot of the challenges that we're seeing right now. They also have to do with how the success that a lot of European companies had in China over the past decades made them sleepy and complacent. And now they're waking up to a reality where they really have to get their own act together. And I think the most successful strategy in also engaging with China and challenging China and finding pathways forward is to fix a lot of these problems and regain confidence in dynamism. And so that's a lot to ask, and we're not even talking about geopolitics. I mean, a lot of the attention and resources are going on defense, on related to the war in Ukraine. So that's also distracting a lot. But yeah, the best way forward, I think, is really to get your house in order and unite around these fields, and also engage with companies and not work against them. I think in Europe we still have a lot of confrontation between what the government is trying to do and what companies want. There is a disconnect that's causing frictions, and this is not really helping the situation.
Yeah, and again, I think it's a really tricky situation because, to your earlier point, yeah, I guess there's learning that actually Europe badly needs, right, in terms of innovation. You learn in China, you can use that learning for the benefit of global operations. And then at the same time, you've got Europe, pushing for more resilience. But if they go too far and then it goes into protectionism, where does that learning come from for European companies to be competitive?
Yeah, I think there's a lack of understanding between politicians and business in Europe. I think, again, this complete vast regulation tsunami that we encountered over the last years has, surprise, caused companies to actually exit Europe, and go to other places. And in a way, so in a way, we have to sort of scale back on that. We have to also boost our education system. 50 of the best 100 universities in engineering are in China. So no surprise that actually China has a very deep bench on good engineers to get things done, And we have to really see that our education system is geared towards curiosity. For example, we should really have in the kindergarten and primary school sets that people can play around with chemistry, do physical tests and so forth. We have to get our kids interested in science again. And that's lacking. And on top of it, the language that our politicians are using is confrontational, meaning it's tribal, one against the other. I think there should be a common understanding as we only can do this together. And pull ourselves out. I mean, Draghi has made a wonderful report a year ago, and only 11% of the items were sort of fulfilled in 1 year. So we are way too slow, and it has to do with the fact we live in a system where our politicians find it difficult to come from out of the bench of vetocracy. Everything has been vetoed, you know.
Yeah.
And you can see in Denmark, for example, Denmark has been doing quite well over the last 1 or 2 years because if you are in a coalition, you work together. In my country, we have a coalition that seems to work against each other and causing this fragility. We have to learn that if we keep doing this, then we might not have a democracy in the medium or long term anymore at home.
I know. But do you feel, yeah, that globalization is ending, or it's evolving? It's going to be more regional, a more multi-aligned system. How do you see it playing out?
Yeah, globalization, as we learned in the 90s and the teens, is certainly not happening anymore. And part of the driver is certainly also the United States. It's not just China, and they sort of feed on each other apparently. So in a way, we have to just see how we can sustain a certain openness. But it's clear that companies have to realign themselves again. Was three markets, you know, it's the US and US sort of in a broader sense, and then we have China, and then we have the rest of the world that can align with Europe on this one. But yeah, business has to change. You know, we used to run companies and factories and just in time, and now we have to basically just in case. And all
Yeah.
of that is certainly not what we like to have. Again, it's a great pity, but if you're looking into the vibes of countries, the ideology that's happening, I don't see that China and the United States are changing their program anytime soon.
Yeah. Yeah. Before we wrap up, I'd like to ask each of you if you could offer one key takeaway to global executives from this conversation, what would it be? Max?
Well, I would say brace yourself and define your business strategy in the context of a quickly evolving economic security landscape.
I would say that companies have to pay far more attention to geopolitics. Their public affairs is mostly geared towards how do I talk to the government, and it's missing the early warning systems that actually are available on the marketplace. Second, I would say, you know, don't extrapolate. You know, if it's bad today, it doesn't necessarily it's bad tomorrow. You just have to have the ability to draw scenarios that gives you the options to act upon. Business always wants to act upon something. And so, in a way, people just have to beef up that segment in order to give the management the tools in order to steer the company into the future.
Indeed. So, I mean, I think again, the message that I take away is that de-risking isn't retreat; it's about control, and that Europe and China they will be tightly connected. But how to have the goal to make that independence smarter, a bit more transparent, more sustainable, and build balance in this area of industrial competition and geopolitical caution. Well, that brings us to an end of this episode of Let's Talk Global Business. We'll be back next time with a new topic. Thank you, Joerg and Max, for sharing your insights with us. You can find more content on the global economy and listen to the full series by visiting conference-board.org. Until next time on Let's Talk Global Business. Thank you.